coins came first, and then the paper. Nell Ashby sat on the edge of her cot in the narrow attic above the still room at Hartfield House, counting banknotes by the light of a tallow candle that smelled faintly of mutton. 10 notes, £1,000. Her fingers, which had spent the day grinding comfrey root and stirring camphor into beeswax, left a faint greenish smear on the corner of the topmost note, and she rubbed at it with her thumb and only made it worse. The pile looked wrong against her hands. It looked wrong against the coarse gray blanket. It looked wrong in the room at all, like a swan set down in a coal scuttle, and she could not stop touching it, as if to make certain it had not dissolved. She had been called up to the dowager's sitting room an hour before, summoned by Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper, with a look that meant, straighten your apron and say yes to whatever is asked. The Dowager Countess of Marchford had been propped against 3 pillows the color of weak tea, her wrists thin enough that the lace of her sleeves hung empty around them, and she had looked at Nell the way she looked at everyone, as if estimating the cost of the cloth they were cut from. "You will be given £1,000 tomorrow morning," the dowager had said, without preamble. "You will have 1 week to spend it. At the end of the week, you will bring what you have bought to the ballroom and lay it on a table for the household to see. You will not discuss this with anyone below stairs. You will not refuse." Nell had said nothing for a long moment, because there was nothing in the training of a still-room maid for a sentence like that. The dowager had watched her absorb it, then added, with the faint, dry smile of a woman who had perfected condescension as a craft, "Consider it a charitable exercise. I wish to see what a woman of your station does with what she has never had. There will be 9 other women given the same, gentlewomen. You among them as a study in contrast. You will be evaluated only as a servant, Miss Ashby. Your continued employment in this house depends on your full participation. Do you understand?" Nell had said she understood. She had not understood. She had said it because Mrs. Pell's eyes had warned her to, and because her wages were £1.12 a quarter, and she sent half of that to her aunt in Southwark, and because the apothecary's shop she had grown up in had been sold 3 years ago to pay her father's debts, and she had nowhere else to go. Now, on the cot, she stacked the notes a second time, and a third. She did not think she had ever held this much paper at once in her life. Her father, in his best year, had not earned £1,000 across all 12 months of it. She thought of his hands, brown stained at the cuticles, weighing out half a grain of laudanum onto a square of waxed paper, while a woman with a sick child waited at the counter. She thought of the brown glass bottle in her apron pocket, the one she had carried for 3 years now, empty since the morning he died. She slid her hand into the pocket and felt for it without looking, the way some women fingered a cross. The glass was cool and slightly rough where the paper label had been scraped off long ago. It steadied her. It always did. A charitable exercise. The dowager's voice had been precise about that. A study. Nell turned the phrase over and could not make it sit flat. She knew, distantly, that the Earl was being pressed to marry. The whole servants' hall knew. She had heard Mrs. Pell tell the cook that the dowager would have him at the altar before Michaelmas, if she had to drag him there in her shroud. But that had nothing to do with Nell, and the dowager had said nothing of marriage, only of spending and of contrast. And Nell, who had learned in her father's shop that the worst thing one could do with a stranger's instruction was to invent a meaning it had not been given. accepted what she had been told.
A study. Very well. She would be studied. She blew out the candle and lay down with the notes folded inside the apothecary bottle's wrapping cloth under her pillow, and she did not sleep. She made a list in the dark: comfrey, camphor, willow bark, oil of cloves, a clean mortar to replace the chipped one, linen, wax, a proper set of scales. She made the list the way she had been taught to make any list, by need, by use, by what a person could not do without. The £1,000 in her mind did not belong to her. It had been placed in her hands for a week. At the end of the week, she would set it down again on a table in the ballroom, transformed into things that someone could use, and the dowager would see what a still-room maid did when she was given more than she had ever been given, and that would be that. She did not even once think of a dress. Below her, 3 stories down and 2 corridors over, the Earl of Marchford stood at the long window of the green drawing-room and watched a coachman cross the wet flags of the Mews, carrying a lantern. The rain had stopped an hour before. The flags shone like the inside of a shell. He had been standing there since the doctor had left his mother's room, and he had not spoken in all that time, because there had been no one in the room to speak to, and because there was nothing he wished to say aloud that would not, if heard, undo him. His mother had told him about the test at 6 o'clock. She had described it in the same tone she used to discuss the linen accounts. 10 women, 1,000 each, a week to spend. The ballroom on the next Thursday. He would choose his bride based on what they brought. She had been quite calm about it, and quite immovable. And when he had told her that he would not consent to such a vulgar piece of theatre, she had said, without looking up from the ledger in her lap, "Then I will die before the season ends with you unmarried, and the title will pass to your cousin Gerald, who beats his horses." Choose, Henry. He had not chosen. He had walked out of her room and down the stairs and into the green drawing-room and stopped at the window, and the lantern of the coachman had moved across the mews and away into the dark, and he had thought, with a particular clarity that came to him only when he was very tired, that he had been failing women in his family for 14 months now, and that this would simply be one more. He thought of his brother in the canal. He always thought of his brother in the canal. The black water and the white face and the hand that had not quite reached the bank. He thought of it the way other men thought of the time of day, automatically, without needing to summon it. He had not jumped in. He had stood on the towpath in his evening clothes and shouted for the bargeman, and by the time the pull came, his brother had gone under for the 3rd time. That was the truth of it. The coroner had said the current was strong and the night was cold, and no man in evening dress could have done otherwise. The coroner had been generous. Marchford had not asked for generosity. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. Somewhere above him, in an attic he had never seen, a woman whose name he did not know was lying awake with £1,000 under her pillow and a list of medicines in her head, and the test his mother had built was already in motion, and he did not yet know that the part of it which would undo him was not benign gentlewomen at all. The morning came up grey and even. Nell rose before the bell, dressed in the dark, tied her apron twice round because she had lost weight that winter, and slid the brown bottle into the pocket where it always sat. She went down the back stairs with the notes folded into a square of oilcloth against her ribs, and she did not touch the wad once on the way down,
though she felt it at every step, like a stone someone had asked her to carry, without saying why.
She had a week. She had a list. She had her father's hands, which were also her hands now. She would do what she had been trained to do. She did not yet know that she had been given the whole of the Earl's allowance for the year in paper, nor that 9 other women in 9 other houses across London were dressing at that same hour, with maids fastening their stays, nor that the Dowager Countess of Marchford had told her one truth, and withheld a larger one, nor that the larger one was the only one that mattered. She knew only that the day was grey, that the kitchen fire was already lit, and that Thomas, the housekeeper's grandson, was sitting on the still-room step with his chin on his fists, waiting for her, because he always waited for her, and that the world, for the moment, was the size of his small round face, turning up at the sound of her tread. "You're late," Thomas said. "I'm not." She set down her basket. "You're early." He considered this. He was 8, and he considered everything as if he had been hired to do it. "Mrs. Pell said you went to the Dowager last night." "I did." "Are you in trouble?" "No, Thomas." He looked at her with the unblinking judgment of a child who had not yet been taught to pretend. "Your hand is shaking." She looked down. It was. She set it flat against her apron, and the shaking went into the cloth, and from the cloth into nothing, and she smiled at him, the way she had learned to smile at customers in her father's shop when she was 12, and had to take their money and pretend her father was only resting in the back. "It's only the cold," she told him. He did not believe her. He was 8. He believed almost nothing he was told. But he came down off the step and followed her into the still room anyway, because she was Nell, and because she had let him grind the dried mint last Tuesday with his own small hands, and that, for Thomas, settled most questions before they began. The still room at Hartfield was a long, narrow chamber at the back of the basement, lined on 3 sides with shelves of dark glass and pewter, with a flagged floor that sloped half an inch to a drain at the centre, so that spills could be swept away without staining. A copper still sat at the far end, like a small fat saint. The window above the bench was set high in the wall and gave on to the area steps. In summer, one could hear the iron gate clang each time the delivery boy came through. Nell had loved the room from her first day in it. It was the only room in the house that smelled of her father. She set her basket on the bench. She unwrapped the oilcloth. Thomas, who had climbed onto the stool by the window and was kicking his heels softly against the rung, said nothing for a long moment, and then said, in the quiet, careful voice he used when he understood that something unusual was occurring and did not wish to be sent away for asking, "Is that money?" "Yes." "Is it yours?" She paused. She was a woman trained to weigh, and she weighed the question. "It has been given to me to spend." "On what?" "On things that are useful." She refolded the oilcloth and laid the bundle in the drawer where she kept her good scales. She turned the small brass key. She put the key in her apron pocket beside the bottle. "Thomas, you will not tell anyone you saw this." "All right." "Not Mrs. Pell, not the cook, not the boot boy." "All right." He kicked the rung again. He watched her tie on her working apron over the first one. "Nell?" "Yes." "Are you going away?" She stopped with her hands at the apron strings. She looked at him properly. His hair stood up on the crown where he had slept on it. His ears were pink from the cold of the stairs. She thought, with a small dry pang she did not allow herself to name, that no one had ever asked her that question before, because no one before Thomas had ever cared about the answer. "No," she told him. "I am going shopping, that is all." He nodded gravely. He accepted shopping as a category of event that occasionally befell adults and required no further explanation. He slid down off the stool and came to stand beside her at the bench, and he reached up and patted her hand once with his small, flat palm, in the manner of a man comforting another man at a funeral. And then he climbed back onto the stool and asked when they were going to make the cough syrup for his grandmother, because she had been awake half the night again, and Nell, whose chest had gone tight at the padding in a way she had not expected, said they were going to make it now, this morning, before anything else. And she took down the willow bark and the honey and set Thomas to weighing what he could weigh, and the day began. She did not go out for the things on her list until the afternoon. She wanted Mrs. Pell to be off at the linen draper's first, because she did not wish to explain a sudden purse to anyone who might guess at the shape of what was in it. When the back door had closed on Mrs. Pell's bonnet, Nell took down her cloak and tied it under her chin and went up the area steps into a thin London sun that had begun, against all promise, to push through the cloud. She walked. She had thought she would feel the money as a weight, but what she felt instead was a strange stillness, as if she had been entrusted with a sleeping animal and must not wake it. She went first to the apothecary on Wigmore Street, because she knew his prices and trusted his stock, and she stood at the counter for a quarter of an hour and gave him a list that made his eyebrows climb steadily up his forehead until they vanished under his wig. Comfrey root, 3 pounds. Camphor, ½ pound. Oil of cloves, 2 ounces. Tincture of myrrh. Tincture of opium, a small quantity, properly labeled. Willow bark in quantity. Senna. Chamomile flowers. Linseed. A pound of beeswax. He listened without interruption. He weighed and wrapped and tied. He looked at her when she set the first banknote on the counter, with the expression of a man recalculating a stranger from the floor up, and then, because he was a tradesman and not a fool, he said nothing at all and gave her the change in coin, which she put away in a small canvas bag that had once held flour. She went next to the ironmonger on Marylebone High Street for a proper set of brass scales, the kind her father had used, with the round pans and the small graduated weights, because the scales in the Hartfield still-room were tin and warped, and she had been compensating for their lean for 2 years. She went to the glass merchant for a dozen new dispensing bottles and a dozen small, stoppered jars. She went to the linen warehouse for 2 bolts of unbleached cloth for bandages, because Mrs. Pell had been making do with torn sheets since Christmas. She went to a stationer for a clean ledger and a steel-nibbed pen and a bottle of ink, because she had been keeping the still-room records on the backs of grocers' bills. She walked back through the lamps coming on. She had spent, by her reckoning, 172 pounds and a few shillings. She had 6 days left and 828 pounds to spend, and she did not yet know what she would do with the rest of it. But she knew, with the same quiet certainty with which she had known her father was dying when he stopped correcting her measurements, that whatever she bought would have to be useful, or she would not be able to set it down on the table at the end of the week and look at it.
she touched the brown bottle through her apron and went down the area steps and let herself back into the house she did not yet know she had been brought into the center of. By the third day, she had begun to draw notice, not from the family never noticed the still room, but from the tradesmen, and from one another still-room maid at the surgeon's house on Henrietta Street, who had come round to ask why Mr.
Solmes's apprentice had said that the Hartfield girl was buying out half his stock. Nell, who had spent the morning standing at the bench packing salves into the new jars while Thomas labelled them in his careful schoolroom hand, had told the other maid only that the housekeeper had decided to lay in supplies. The other maid had looked at her sidelong and gone away unsatisfied, and Nell had returned to the bench and tried to keep her hands from shaking, because she had begun, in the small hours of that morning, to understand that whatever she had been told about the exercise, there was more inside it than she had been allowed to see. She did not, even then, guess at marriage. The idea did not arise. She had been told she was being evaluated as a servant. She had been told there were 9 gentlewomen also given the sum. She had not been told why, and she did not ask, because asking was not a thing servants did. But she felt the weight of being watched, the same way a creature in a thicket feels itself watched without yet seeing the eye. And she went about her purchases more quietly after that, and she sent the deliveries to the area door at hours when the kitchen was empty. On the 4th day she went to a place she had not been in 3 years, and that was the only purchase that broke her open. She walked to Lambeth and stood outside the door of the small shop her father had once owned, the one that had been sold to a man named Combe to pay the funeral and the back rent, and she went inside. And Mr. Combe, who was older now and had taken on an apprentice and who remembered her, let her into the back room where her father's old chest still sat under a tarpaulin, because no one had ever come to claim it. Mr. Combe had written to her once, and the letter had gone astray. He had kept the chest anyway. He said it was hers, if she could carry it. She paid him for the carriage of it. She paid him also for 3 of her father's old books, which he had set aside in a separate parcel, the dispensatory, the herbal, and the small black notebook in her father's own hand, where he had written out every formula he had ever invented, and every patient he had ever forgiven a bill for. She paid more than he asked. She paid because she could, and because she had spent her whole life watching her father turn away from money he was owed, and because there was a kind of justice in paying generously now, with money that had been given to her for no reason she could understand. She walked back across the river with the small black notebook pressed against her ribs inside her cloak, and she did not cry until she was in the still room with the doors shut, and Thomas asleep on the bench with his head on a folded sack. And then she cried, very quietly, with her face in her apron, for the length of time it took the kettle to boil. And then she stopped, and she wiped her face, and she opened the notebook to the first page, and she read in her father's hand, "For Mrs. Hadley, who could not pay, the last I have of the comfrey, with my compliments. 2 drachms thrice daily. R. Ashby, 1819. She closed the notebook. She took out the brown bottle and set it on the bench. She sat down on the stool and looked at the bottle in the candlelight, and did not move for a long while. She thought of the woman, Mrs. Hadley, whose name she had never known, and whose pain her father had eased with the last of what he had. And she thought that there was no test in the world,
charitable or otherwise, that she would be able to fail if she only spent the money the way he would have spent it. On the 5th day she bought blankets for the Foundling Hospital in Bloomsbury, 6 dozen of them, and a quantity of clean linen, and a standing order with the apothecary on Wigmore Street to supply the hospital with cough syrup and willow tincture for the rest of the quarter, paid in advance. On the 6th day she bought a proper second-hand brass mortar, because the one in the still room had a crack running down one side that she had been pretending not to see. And she bought a set of measuring glasses graduated in minims, and she bought, after standing in front of the shop window for nearly half an hour, a single bolt of fine bleached linen, because she had calculated that with it she could make new still-room aprons for herself and for the 2 scullery maids, and for Mrs. Pell, who had been wearing the same apron for 4 years and would not say so. On the 7th day, which was the day before the ball, she sat at the bench and made up her ledger. She wrote in it every purchase, every price, every recipient. She tallied. She came to £999. She had £1 left. 1 single banknote, the last of the 10, folded small. She sat for a long time with it in her hand. She thought of buying a ribbon. She thought of buying a pair of stockings without darns in them. She thought of the small things she had not let herself want for 3 years. She turned the note over and over between her fingers, and felt the brown bottle in her pocket, and thought of her father, who had died with 32 shillings to his name, and no debt to any man he had treated. She folded the note and put it inside the apothecary bottle, and she put the stopper back in, and she put the bottle back in her apron pocket, and she went to bed without spending the last £1, because she could not think of a thing she could buy with it that would be worth more than the fact of not having spent it. She did not call it that. She did not, in her own mind, use the word. But the word had begun to gather around her hands without her noticing. What was worth keeping? What was worth doing? What a thing was worth? And it would be there in her mouth before the next day ended, though she did not yet know how. The Dowager Countess of Marchford was not asleep when Mrs. Pell came up with the evening tisane. She had not slept properly in 9 weeks. She sat up against her pillows, with the ledger open across her knees as if reading it, though the print had gone soft at the edges some days ago, and she was largely remembering. She watched the housekeeper set the cup down. "Mrs. Pell, the girl." "My lady." "She has been spending." "She has, my lady." "On what?" Mrs. Pell hesitated. She had not been instructed to spy, and she did not wish to be cast as one. But the dowager was dying, and there were courtesies owed. "On medicines, my lady, and on supplies for the still-room, and on linen for the maids, and, I am told, on blankets for the Foundling Hospital in Bloomsbury." The dowager closed the ledger. She set it aside. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she looked up again her eyes were the eyes of a woman who had spent 50 years arranging the world to her satisfaction, and was, very late, beginning to suspect she had arranged the wrong thing. "Has she bought no dress?" "No, my lady." "No slippers, no fan, no ribbon?" "No, my lady." "No jewelry?" "No, my lady." The dowager drew a slow breath that caught at the top of it and made her wince. She turned her face toward the window. The rain had begun again. She had told Nell Ashby that the test would reveal what each woman believed was worth having. She had thought she had known what answer the girl would give. She had thought the girl would buy a dress, because a still-room maid in a borrowed silk would have made the contrast complete, and the dowager had wanted the contrast complete, because she had wanted her son to see what 9 gentlewomen would do when £10,000 was set down in front of them, and she had wanted the maid only as a counterweight, a small, dull stone on the other side of the scale to keep the dish from flying up. She had not expected the stone to outweigh them. Mrs. Pell, my lady, the thing I have done. The dowager did not look round. I am not certain it was kind. Mrs. Pell, who had been at Hartfield since before the dowager's husband had died, who had known the family through 3 deaths and 1 ruin and a long, slow consumption, who had seen the boy Henry come back from the canal at 4 in the morning with his coat dark to the elbows and his face the color of paper. Mrs. Pell took the empty tisane cup and set it on the tray and said, with the perfect neutrality of a woman who had earned the right, "It was never going to be, my lady." The dowager laughed once, a short dry sound that ended in a cough. "No, I suppose it was not." She did not change the test. She did not call the girl back. She lay in her bed and watched the rain, and thought of what her son was going to look like when he walked into the ballroom and saw on a table the things the still-room maid had bought with £1,000. And she was, for the first time in some weeks, afraid. Not of dying. She had stopped being afraid of dying in October. She was afraid that she had done a clumsy thing at the end of a life she had thought was elegant, and that the clumsiness was going to land in her son, who had already been carrying more weight than she had given him credit for, and who did not need any more. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She heard, somewhere 2 floors below and at the back of the house, the small distant clink of a glass bottle being set down on the stone bench, and she thought, against her will, that she had been a fool to mistake silence for emptiness in any room of her own house. Down in the still room, Nell was not at the bench. She had finished her ledger and gone up to bed. Thomas, who should also have been asleep, had crept back down because he had remembered something he wished to ask her, and had found the room empty, and had stood on tiptoe to look at the table. The table had been laid out in preparation for the morning. Every purchase Nell had made over the week sat on it in careful order. The jars of salve, the bottles of tincture, the rolls of linen, the new scales, the Foundling Hospital invoices, the bolt of fine linen for the aprons, the brass mortar, her father's books, the ledger open at the final tally. Thomas walked the length of the table with his hands behind his back, as he had been taught to walk past anything fragile, and he read the labels in his small, slow way, and he understood, with the strange, clean comprehension children sometimes had, that what was on the table was the whole of what Nell had done with a great deal of money, and that none of it was for her. He stood for a moment longer. Then he picked up one of the small jars of cough salve, the one labeled, in his own handwriting, for grandmother, and he held it in both hands, and he carried it carefully up the back stairs and put it under his pillow, because he was 8, and because he did not yet know how else to keep a thing safe. Above him, in the green drawing-room, the Earl of Marchford had not gone to bed. He had been in the room for most of the evening with a decanter he had not touched, and a fire that had burnt down to its red bones. He was thinking, as he had been thinking for 7 days, that in the morning 10 women would walk into his mother's ballroom with the spoils of £1,000 apiece arrayed on tables, and that he would be expected to walk between them, like a man choosing a horse, and that he had not yet found a way to refuse that did not kill his mother before the month was out. He heard a small sound at the door. He turned. Thomas stood in the doorway in his nightshirt, holding nothing now, having left the jar under his pillow upstairs, looking at the Earl with the open, unembarrassed appraisal of a child who had never been told to be afraid of him. "You are not allowed up here," Marchford said. He said it without sharpness. He had a fondness for the boy he did not examine. "I know. Then why are you—" Thomas considered. He had come down on an errand and abandoned it. He was at loose ends, in a great house at night, with a thing in his head he wanted to set down somewhere safe before he went back to sleep. He looked at the Earl. The Earl, in Thomas's private hierarchy, ranked just below Nell and just above the cook, and was the only person in the house who had ever stopped on the stairs to ask him his name. "Nell bought blankets for the foundling children," Thomas said. The Earl, who had been about to send the boy back to bed, did not move. "What?" "With the money, she bought blankets, 6 dozen, and medicine for the apothecary to send, and linen for the maids' aprons, and a mortar because the other one was cracked, and books that belonged to her father." Thomas paused. He was not certain why he was saying it, only that it had been heavy in him, and the Earl was the nearest tall person. "And she did not buy a dress." The Earl set his glass down. He did it slowly, with the care of a man who had felt the room tilt, and was steadying himself against any sudden movement that might tilt it further. "No," he said. "Ashby, she works in the still room." Thomas frowned, considering whether the Earl really did not know, and concluded, charitably, that he simply might not. "She makes the cough syrup. She is teaching me how to grind." "How old are you, Thomas?" 8. "And she, Miss Ashby, was given £1,000. "By the Dowager, yes." Thomas, who had been told nothing, and who had inferred everything, looked at the Earl very steadily. "Is it bad that she spent it on the foundlings?" The Earl did not answer at once. He sat down on the edge of the chair behind him, slowly, as if his knees had become uncertain. He looked at the boy, and through him, and past him, at a still room he had never entered, and at a woman whose face he could not have described if his life had depended on it. He thought of 9 other tables in 9 other houses being laid out at that moment with silks and slippers and jeweled combs and lengths of Brussels lace, and he thought of one table in his own basement laid with jars and bandages and a brass mortar, and a child's careful schoolroom handwriting. And he understood, with the awful, unspooling clarity of a man who had finally been shown what he had been refusing to look for, exactly what his mother had built, and exactly what had walked into it without knowing. "No, Thomas," he said. His voice was strange to him. "It is not bad." "All right." Thomas accepted this, and yawned, and rubbed his eye with the heel of his hand. He turned to go. At the door he stopped, because he had remembered another thing, and because the Earl had not yet sent him away. "She keeps a brown bottle in her pocket. She touches it when she is afraid. I think it was her father's. She does not know I have seen her." He left. He went up the back stairs to his cot. He put his hand under the pillow on the small cool jar of cough salve, and went to sleep almost at once, in the way of children who had said the thing they came to say. The Earl sat in the chair for a long time. The fire went out. He did not light it again. He thought, with the slow, brutal honesty he had been avoiding for 14 months, that he had spent every day since his brother's death believing he was not worth the title that had fallen to him, and that he had built his refusal to marry on that belief, like a man building a house on a sandbar, and that he had been spared, by no merit of his own, from learning until this hour that there was a woman in his own basement who had spent a week proving, without any knowledge that she was being watched for it, without any wish to be chosen, without any strategy at all, what worth looked like when it was not performed. He understood that he was going to walk into the ballroom in the morning already undone, and that there was nothing he could do about it now, and that he was glad. He understood that the only act of mercy left to him was to not pretend, at the reveal, that he had not already known. He sat in the dark until the dark began to gray. Then he went upstairs and did not sleep, and dressed himself without ringing for his man, and went down to the ballroom an hour before he was due, because he wanted to see the table before the room filled, and because he was afraid, for the first time in 14 months, of failing someone who deserved better than his failure. The ballroom at Hartfield had been arranged with 10 long tables set at intervals around the walls, each with the name of a participant on a small card at the front. The dowager had been carried down in a chair and placed at the head of the room on a dais. She sat with a shawl over her knees and her hands folded, with the deliberation of a woman conserving every motion she had left. The room had filled by 10 with the better part of the season, perhaps 200, because the dowager had let it be known that the Earl would announce his choice today, and because no one in London had been able to resist the symmetry of 10 women and £10,000. The 9 gentlewomen arrived in carriages, their tables filled. Silks were unfolded and laid out. Slippers in pairs were set out in rows. Sets of pearl combs and ivory fans and embroidered shawls were arranged with the careful asymmetry that meant a lady's maid had been at the table for an hour beforehand. One young woman had spent the whole sum on a single emerald necklace, which lay coiled on black velvet at the center of her table like a small bright snake. Another had bought a phaeton, which could not be brought into the ballroom. She had a painting of it, framed and mounted on an easel beside her. A third had paid down a portion of her family's mortgage, and had brought the receipt in a leather case, which the dowager noted, with a small private flicker, was the only thing on any of the 9 tables that came close. Nell's table was the last to be arranged. She came up the back stairs from the still room in her plain stuff gown, with the new, clean apron tied over it. She had made the apron the night before, from the bolt of bleached linen, the first one finished out of the 4 she had planned, and she had thought, with the small, wry honesty she allowed herself only when no one was watching, that it would be impolite to bring nothing of herself into the room. Thomas walked behind her, carrying a basket. Mrs. Pell walked behind Thomas, carrying a second. 2 of the footmen carried the rest. She did not look at the gentlewomen's tables as she passed. She looked only at her own card on the last table at the far end of the room, and she went to it, and she set out, in the order she had written them in her ledger, every purchase she had made. The jars of salve, the bottles of tincture labeled in her own and Thomas's hands, the bolt of remaining linen, the brass mortar, the new scales set out level, the Foundling Hospital invoices in a neat stack, the standing order with the apothecary on Wigmore Street, her father's 3 books. The ledger, open to the final page, the column tallied to £999. The empty space at the end of the column, where the last pound had not been entered. She did not put the brown bottle on the table. The bottle stayed in her pocket. The last banknote stayed inside the bottle. She stepped back from the table when she had finished, and she folded her hands in front of her apron, and she looked at the floor, because she had been trained to look at the floor in rooms where her betters were standing, and she waited. The Earl was already in the room. He had been standing against the far wall behind the dowager's dais since before the gentlewomen had arrived. He had watched Nell come in. He had watched her set out the jars. He had watched Thomas, with great concentration, place a small label upright against the bottle of willow tincture because it had fallen flat. He had watched her step back and fold her hands. He walked the length of the room. He did not look at the other 9 tables. He went past them, past the emerald on its velvet, past the painted phaeton, past the mortgage receipt, past the silks and the slippers and the combs, and he stopped at Nell's table at the end. He stood in front of it for what the room afterwards agreed was almost a full minute, in which no one in 200 people made a sound, because every person there had understood, before he opened his mouth, what was happening.
The dowager, on her dais, closed her eyes.
The Earl reached out and picked up one of the small jars. He turned it in his hand. The label, in Thomas's careful round hand, said, "For grandmother, 2 spoonfuls at night." He set it down. He picked up the Foundling Hospital invoice. He read it. He set it down. He picked up the ledger and read the column to the bottom and saw that the tally stopped £1 short, and he set the ledger down, very gently, as if it might break. And he looked up at Nell. "Miss Ashby." She lifted her eyes. She did not know him. She had been at Hartfield for 14 months, and he had never come to the still room, and she had been in the same room as him at chapel 3 times, and had been looking at the floor on each occasion, and she had no face in her mind to attach the title to, and she had not understood, until he spoke her name in that voice, in this room, with 200 people watching, that whatever the test had been, it had not been what she had been told. She saw in his face that he knew her. She did not understand how. She felt, distantly, Thomas's hand creep into the side of her apron, and she folded her own hand around his, without taking her eyes off the Earl's, because the boy was 8, and had not known what he was bringing her into, either. "My lord," she said, "you have spent £999. "Yes, my lord." "Where is the last?" She did not answer at once. The room had gone very quiet. The dowager, on her dais, opened her eyes. The 9 gentlewomen at their 9 tables had all, by some shared instinct, turned to face the last table at the end of the room. Nell felt the brown bottle in her pocket, and felt the folded banknote inside the bottle, and she felt Thomas's hand in her apron, and she understood that she had been brought, without her knowledge, into the middle of something she had not consented to, and could not now refuse. She took the bottle out of her pocket. She did not look at the room. She looked at the Earl. She set the bottle on the table among the jars and the bandages and the open ledger, and she said, with a level voice she had used in her father's shop at 12, when the man with the sick child had asked her if she was sure, "Inside, my lord. I could not think what to spend it on." The Earl looked at the bottle. He looked at her hand, which was steady. He looked at her face, which was not. "What did it hold?" he said. He did not mean the banknote. "The last thing my father made for someone who couldn't pay." The dowager, on her dais, made a small sound that might have been her name being said by someone 20 years dead. The Earl, who had been holding himself very straight, closed his eyes for the length of one breath. When he opened them again, the room saw, every one of the 200 saw, and would talk about it for the rest of the season, that the Earl of Marchford was crying, without making any sound at all, in the controlled, stationary way of a man who had not cried at his brother's funeral, and was not, even now, going to make a public business of it. He did not announce his choice. He did not need to. He came round the end of the table. He took Nell's free hand, the one Thomas was not holding, and he turned it palm up, and he looked at it. Her knuckles were raw. There was a small green stain at the base of her thumb, where she had not been able to scrub the comfrey out. The Earl bent his head over her hand for a moment, and then he let it go, and he straightened, and he addressed the room without raising his voice, which was the only thing that kept the room from breaking apart at the seams. "My mother set a test," he said. "I do not think she knew what she was testing for. I did not know either. I think Miss Ashby is the only person in this room who has been honest for a week, because she did not know she was being asked to be." He paused. He looked at the dowager. The dowager, on her dais, gave him the smallest nod, the kind a woman gave when she conceded a game she had not realized she was playing. "I am not worth the title that fell to me. I have not been worth it for 14 months. I do not believe I will ever be worth it in the way my brother would have been. But I have understood, this morning, that worth is not something one inherits, so I will not pretend any longer that it is. I will marry, if she will have me, the woman who spent £1,000 on other people's pain. I will ask her in private. I will not ask her here." He turned. He left the ballroom. He went out by the side door that led to the back stairs, because he could not bear to walk back down the length of the room, past the 9 tables, and because he had understood, on the way round the end of Nell's, that the only thing he could give her in that moment was the chance to follow him out without being watched doing it. The room, after a long pause, began to move again. The 9 gentlewomen began, with the dignity their training had given them, to pack their tables. The dowager, on her dais, lifted one finger, and Mrs. Pell came to her, and the dowager said, in a voice almost too soft to hear, "Tell the girl she has my blessing. Tell her I am sorry for the manner of asking." Mrs. Pell nodded once, and went away to find Nell, who had picked up the brown bottle off the table and put it back in her pocket, and was standing very still, with Thomas's hand still in her apron, and who had not yet moved, because she was a still-room maid, and did not know, even now, that she was permitted to leave a room without being dismissed. It was Thomas who moved her. He tugged on her apron. She looked down at him. "You should go after him," Thomas said. "He went up the back stairs. He does not know where the still room is. He will get lost." She looked at the boy. She looked at the door the Earl had gone through. She looked, last, at the table she had laid, at the jars and the bandages, and the open ledger, and the brass mortar, and her father's books with his handwriting inside them. And she thought of the brown bottle in her pocket, and the folded note inside it. And she understood, for the first time in 7 days, what she had been spending. She went after him. She found him in the still room, which he had, in fact, found, without getting lost. He was standing at the bench with his hand flat on the wood, the way a man stood at the rail of a ship he had only just stopped being sick over. He had not lit the candle. The room was lit only by the late gray light coming down from the high window, and by the small red glow of the banked still-room stove. He turned when he heard her step. He did not move toward her. She stopped in the doorway. "My lord?" "Please," he said, "not in this room." She came in. She shut the door. She did not know what to do with her hands. She put them, in the absence of any other instruction, into her apron pocket, and they closed around the brown bottle, which was warm now from being held. "Henry," she said. She tried the name. She had heard the dowager use it once. It felt large in her mouth. She did not know if she was permitted it. She used it anyway, because the man at the bench was not, just at this moment, an earl, and because she had spent the morning being addressed by a title she had not earned, and she did not wish to compound the trespass by addressing him by one he had only just confessed he could not bear. He drew a breath. He let it out. He turned his face toward her. "You did not know," he said. "No, my lord, Henry. No." "My mother told you it was charity." "She told me it was a study of what a woman of my station did with what she had not had." He laughed. One sound, dry, almost a cough. "She has a gift for half a sentence." "She is dying." "Yes." "I am sorry, my lord. Henry. Henry." He took his hand off the bench. He came across the room slowly, the way one approached a horse one did not wish to startle, and he stopped 2 paces from her, and he looked at her, properly, for the first time, the way one looked at a person one intended to know. And Nell stood her ground, because she had never been any good at being looked at, and she had decided, on the stairs coming down, that she would not start being bad at it now. "You bought blankets for foundlings," he said. "Yes." "And medicines for an apothecary to send out for a quarter." "Yes." "And linen for aprons." "Yes." "And nothing for yourself." "A bolt of bleached linen for aprons," she said. "I am wearing one of them." He looked at the apron. It was very white. It had been ironed badly because she had ironed it by herself at midnight without help, and there was a faint crease across the bib that she had been unable to flatten. He looked at the crease for what felt to her like a long time. Then he said, without looking up, "The pound in the bottle." She took the bottle out of her pocket. She unstoppered it. She tipped the folded note into her palm. She held it out to him. He did not take it. He shook his head once. "Why?" "I could not think of a thing to buy with it that would be worth more than the not having spent it." He closed his eyes again. He opened them. He said, with great care, as if setting down a thing that might shatter, "I have spent 14 months thinking I was not worth the title my brother left me. I have been wrong about what the word means." She folded the note. She slid it back into the bottle. She stoppered the bottle and put it back in her pocket. She said, slowly, because she had not used the word in this configuration before and was finding it as she spoke, Worth is not a thing you inherit, my lord, Henry. I do not think it is a thing you earn either. I think it is a thing you prove every day with your hands, and then the next day you prove it again. That is all. He took the last pace toward her. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could see the small, fair stubble along his jaw that his man had missed in the morning, and that he had not slept, and that his eyes were the color of weak tea like his mother's, though she had not yet seen them in better light. "No," he said. "Yes." "I am going to ask you a question. You are not to answer yes because I have asked it. You are to answer yes only if it is the answer." "All right." "Will you marry me?" She did not answer at once. She had not been asked a question in 14 months that had not been about a measurement or a dose. She had not been asked a question by a man in her life that had been about her. She put her hand into her apron pocket and held the brown bottle, and she felt, through the glass, the folded shape of the last banknote, and she thought of her father, who had died with 32 shillings to his name and no debt to any man he had ever treated. And she thought of the woman with the sick child, and of the foundling hospital in Bloomsbury, and of Thomas's hand in her apron, and of the dowager on her dais closing her eyes, and of the long table at the far end of the ballroom that she had laid out herself with the things 1,000 pounds could become in the hands of a person who had been taught to weigh. She took her hand out of her apron pocket. She held it out to him, open, with the green stain at the base of the thumb that she had not been able to scrub away. He took her hand. He did not bend over it this time. He held it. "Yes," she said. The ordinary day, when it came 3 weeks later. The dowager had not died yet, though she had stopped pretending she would not soon. The banns had been read twice. The household had absorbed, with the slow, heavy patience of a great house adjusting itself, the new fact of Nell, who was now to be called my lady, but who had asked the staff not to do it below stairs, because she did not yet know how to answer to it without flinching. The 9 gentlewomen had gone back to their 9 houses, and would, over the course of the next 2 seasons, marry men who suited them better than the Earl of Marchford would have done. The emerald necklace had been sold, and the money given, by its previous owner, to a charity for blinded soldiers, in a small private gesture that the dowager would not live to learn about, but would have approved. The morning in question was grey and even, the way the morning the test had begun had been grey and even. Nell came down the back stairs at the usual hour, dressed not in stuff, but in plain grey wool, with the new clean apron tied over it. She had finished the other 3 aprons by now, and Mrs. Pell wore one, and the 2 scullery maids each wore one, and the bolt was almost gone. She went into the still room. Thomas was sitting on the stool by the window with his chin on his fists, waiting for her, because he always waited for her, and because the dowager had begun to require a particular tincture for her pain that only Nell knew how to compound, and Thomas had appointed himself the labeling. She set out the things she would need: the brass mortar, no longer cracked, the new scales, level, a small jar, a short list of measurements in her father's hand, taken from the small black notebook that now lived on a shelf above the bench, beside the dispensatory and the herbal. The brown apothecary bottle in her apron pocket, with the folded banknote still inside it, because she had still not been able to think of a thing to spend it on that would be worth more than the keeping of it. She began to work. Thomas weighed what he could weigh. The door behind her opened. She did not turn. She heard the step, which she knew by now. She heard a small clink of china, a cup being set down beside her on the bench, beside the new mortar, beside the brown bottle which she had set out as a witness, because that was what the bottle was for. The Earl did not speak. He waited until she had finished the measurement she was on. Then he said, quietly, so as not to startle her hand, "I brought you tea." "Thank you. Is it the tincture for my mother?" "Yes." "She says it eases her." "It will, for a time." He did not ask how long the time would be. He had stopped asking that. He stood beside her at the bench and watched her hands. She tipped the powder from the scale into the small jar. She added the measured oil. She stoppered the jar. She set it down. She picked up the cup he had brought her, and she drank. Thomas, on his stool, watched the two of them with the small, grave appraisal he had always brought to adult occasions, and decided, in the manner of children who had stopped needing to ask, that everything was where it should be, and that the cough syrup for his grandmother could be made next, after the tincture for the dowager, in the proper order. The Earl picked up the brown bottle from the bench. He turned it in his hand. He had asked her, the first night, what it had held, and she had told him, and he had not asked again, because some answers were not to be made to repeat themselves. He set the bottle down. He looked at the green stain at the base of her thumb, which she had still not been able to scrub away, and which she had stopped trying to. He reached out. He put his hand over hers on the bench, very lightly, as a man might rest a hand on a thing he had been allowed at last to touch. She turned her hand under his and laced her fingers through his fingers, and they stood that way for a moment in the long, narrow chamber at the back of the basement, with the brass mortar and the new scales, and her father's books on the shelf above, and the brown bottle sitting on the bench like a witness, and Thomas on the stool by the window, kicking his heels softly against the rung, and the grey London light coming down through the high window onto her hands and his, which were no longer the only thing in the room she was holding. There is something about the not spending of that last pound that I keep coming back to. The small, empty bottle sitting on a bench beside a brass mortar, refusing to be turned into anything. If you'd like more stories told the way this one was, subscribing keeps the next one close. See you then.